The telegram sat on Erwin Rommel's desk for 6 hours before he responded to it, not because he was busy, not because the intelligence was unclear, because the message from his forward observers was so certain, so mathematically precise in its confidence, that Rommel took his time composing a reply that amounted to a single sentence. Let them come. The date was March 16, 1943. The place was a ridge of hills in central Tunisia, called Jebel Naimia, a name most Americans have never heard, which is precisely the problem. Because what happened on that ridge in the next 72 hours would force the Desert Fox himself, the man who had dismantled British armies like broken watches, to reach for new language to describe what he had witnessed. The Americans were green. Everyone knew it. The Germans had proved it 6 weeks earlier at the Kasserine Pass, where Touen Corps had folded under pressure like wet paper. Rommel had written in his diary that the Americans were brave enough, but tactically illiterate, that their officers led from the rear and their men fought from instinct rather than doctrine. He was right. Then, but there was one variable. Rommel's intelligence network had failed to fully account for. What happens to an army when George S. Patton takes command with 11 days' notice and turns it into something else entirely? 41 men from the 2nd Battalion, 13th Armored Regiment would move on Jebel Naimia. 17 would take the objective. The question this story answers is not how, but why the other 24 still believed it was possible when everything said it wasn't. To understand what Captain James Harley Reid was being asked to do on the morning of March 17, 1943, you need to understand what Tunisia looked like from above. Picture a country being squeezed from 2 directions simultaneously. From the west, Eisenhower's Allied forces, British, American, French, were pressing east toward Tunis. From the east, Montgomery's 8th Army was driving north out of Libya, having finally broken Rommel's Africa Corps at El Amin 4 months earlier. Between these two forces, the Axis held a corridor of mountains and coastal plains no wider than the state of Connecticut. They were trapped. They knew it. And trapped armies are the most dangerous kind, because they have nowhere to retreat to, which means they fight for every ridge and every road junction as if it is the last thing they will ever own. The road junction at Fondouk El Awareb was exactly that. Whoever held it controlled the only viable armored route connecting the German-Italian Panzer Army's northern flank to its supply lines running through Kairouan. Close that road, and an entire armored division could be starved of fuel and ammunition within 72 hours. This was the mathematics that had landed on Eisenhower's desk at Allied Forces headquarters in Algiers, and it was the mathematics that had trickled down through 1st Army to 2nd Corps, to the 1st Armored Division, and finally to Captain James Harley Reid, age 29, of Macon, Georgia. Reid commanded B Company, 2nd Battalion, 13th Armored Regiment, 12 M4 Sherman tanks, 29 infantrymen from an attached rifle platoon, and 1 reconnaissance half-track that had been running on a prayer and a seized differential bearing since Kasserine. He had been given a specific and terrible assignment: advance through the pass at Jebel Naimia, which the maps marked as lightly defended, seize the junction, and hold it until 1st Armored's main force could exploit through. The maps were wrong. Reid didn't know that yet. What Reid knew, standing at his command tank at 4:30 on March 17th with a paper cup of coffee going cold in his hand, was that he had 11 days of Patton behind him and the memory of 6 weeks of failure before that. He had been at Kasserine. Not in the worst of it. B Company had been in reserve, but close enough to see what broken looked like. He had watched a lieutenant colonel walk past him in the wrong direction with his pistol still holstered. He had listened to the radio nets dissolve into static and panic. He had heard a sergeant from the 168th Infantry, a kid from Iowa named Woodward, describe what it felt like when the German 88s opened up on a position your own intelligence had told you was flanked by friendly units. You hear the round before you understand it, Reid wrote home to his wife, Eleanor, in Macon. And then you understand it all at once. That's the worst part, the understanding. Patton had arrived at 22nd Corps headquarters on March 6th, 10 days before Reed's mission. What happened in those 10 days has been called a transformation by historians, but transformation is too soft a word. Patton performed surgery on an army. He fired officers who led from dugouts. He personally drove jeeps through rear area positions and screamed at men who had their helmets unbuckled. He reinstated uniform discipline with a specific and calculated understanding that external discipline, buttons fastened, salutes rendered, ranks respected, was not about appearance. It was about the neural pathway between I follow small rules under pressure and I follow large rules under pressure. If a man could be made to wear his leggings correctly under artillery fire, he could be made to hold a position under the same conditions. Reed had absorbed this. More than that, he had internalized the principle Patton had hammered into every officer briefing since his arrival: an obstacle is information. It tells you where the enemy is not. The briefing for the Jebel Naimia operation arrived at battalion level on March 16th. Intelligence picture, sourced from a network of French colonial informants operating in the hills east of Fondouk, was confident the pass itself was held by no more than a screening force, 2 companies of German infantry from the 86th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, with no armor support forward of the main line. The informant who had provided the primary assessment had been operating for 4 months without a compromised report. His name, in the network records, was Papillon. Papillon was wrong, and by the time Reed found out why, he would be on the wrong side of a mountain with 6 functioning tanks, 11 able-bodied men, and a radio that had just taken a German machine gun burst through its antenna housing. Before he moved, Reed did one last thing. He walked to the half-track where Corporal Darnell Oakes, 22, of Birmingham, Alabama, was checking the vehicle's track tension with a wrench and a flashlight clenched between his teeth. Oakes was the youngest member of the reconnaissance element, the person who would go first if the road went bad. "You eat?" Reed asked him. "Yes, sir. Tell me about the road, what you saw yesterday." Oakes put down the wrench. "Sir, the road looks good up to the 3rd kilometer mark. After that I couldn't see from the OP, but the tracks I saw going in were old. A week, maybe more." Reed nodded. He didn't tell Oakes what the captured German logistics report, translated at Corps that morning, had suggested: that a supply column had passed through Jebel Naimia within 48 hours. The tracks Oakes had seen were not the only tracks that mattered. What he said instead was, stay close to the ridge wall on the way in. Don't let them put you on the open ground. It was the closest thing to a warning he could offer without contradicting the official intelligence picture. It was also, as it turned out, not close enough. 20 kilometers to the northeast, at a stone farmhouse that had been converted into a German regimental command post, Hauptmann Werner Albrecht of the 86th Panzer Grenadier Regiment was pouring schnapps for his officers and telling them what the Americans were going to do. "They will follow the road," he said. "They always follow the road. It is the American genius. They build roads, and then they become prisoners of them." He tapped the map where the Jebel Naimia pass cut through the hills. "We let them come into the throat. Then we close it." He raised his glass. "They are brave enough. They simply do not yet know what brave costs." His officers laughed. This video gives you the story. But the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details. Forgotten heroes free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Link in the description. Now back in the video. B Company moved at 05:15. The darkness in the Tunisian hills at that hour is not the soft darkness of a cloudy night. It is a geological darkness, a darkness that belongs to rock and dry earth and the absence of anything that reflects light. Reed's column of 12 Shermans moved with blackout lights, following the white tape markers laid by the reconnaissance element the previous afternoon, and the only sounds were the grinding of tracks on hardpan and the occasional hiss of a radio net check. Corporal Oakes was 200 meters ahead in the half track, calling back road condition reports every 4 minutes on the dot. At 0547, he called back with something different. "Actual, this is recon. I've got a wire crossing the road at knee height, approximately half a kilometer past the ridge wall. Not on the map. Looks recent. A pause. There's also something wrong with the sound. Reed keyed his mic. Say again on the sound. It's too quiet, sir. No birds. Every veteran of combat in every war and theater has described this phenomenon. The way animals vacate a zone before humans know anything is wrong. The way animals vacate a zone before humans know anything is wrong. The birds at Jebel Naimia had been gone since the previous night, when the second company of the 86th Panzergrenadiers had moved 6 main 42 machine guns, 2 75mm anti-tank guns, and approximately 340 additional infantry into positions that were categorically not on any Allied map. Papillon had been compromised 3 weeks earlier. The Germans had fed him false information twice before allowing him to continue transmitting long enough to establish a pattern of accuracy, and then long enough to use that established accuracy to funnel the Americans into what Hauptmann Albrecht's operations log, captured 6 weeks later, would describe as the kill zone at grid reference 44 high. Of B-53, B Company crossed into grid reference 44 high. The first MG-42 opened up from the ridge at 0554. Then 3 more. Then the anti-tank guns found the column's geometry. They had ranged the road the previous night, recording the distances to 3 specific rock formations that would serve as markers, and the second Sherman in the column, Sergeant Marcus Webb's tank, took a round through the lower hull at 0555. Webb 31 of Charleston, South Carolina, was killed instantly. His driver, Private First Class Louis Tambetti, survived with shrapnel in both legs and managed to exit the burning tank before the ammunition cooked off. Reed's training took over. He was already shouting orders into 2 different radio frequencies simultaneously, calling for the tanks to break left off the road into the dead ground below the ridge, screaming at the infantry half-track to pull its men out before the concentrated fire found it. The first 90 seconds of an ambush are the seconds in which everything is decided. Every decision made in those seconds will either expand or collapse the range of decisions available afterward. Reed made 4 correct decisions in 90 seconds. He would not be able to tell you afterward what they were, because he would not remember making them. This is also something veterans recognize, the way training supersedes consciousness under fire. What he could tell you was the sound of Webb's tank going up, the bass percussion of an ammunition explosion from inside an armored vehicle, and the way that sound functioned less as a noise and more as a physical pressure against his chest. By Uno 6 Den, the situation had clarified into something close to catastrophic. 3 Shermans were destroyed or immobilized. 2 more had taken hit-and-run anti-tank rounds that had damaged their tracks, leaving them mobile only in the sense that they could rotate in place. The infantry element, 29 men, had gone to ground in the shallow draw below the road, where they had cover from the ridge-based MG-42s, but were now being worked on by mortar fire from a position to the east that the pre-mission intel had described as a dry stream bed. The stream bed was not dry, and it was not empty. And then the radio call came. At 0621, Reed's battalion operations frequency crackled with the voice of Major Terence Hollowell, his battalion commander, speaking from a command post that was, by Reed's estimate, approximately 8 kilometers behind him and on the wrong side of any help. Bravo 6, this is Titan 6. Hire has retasked the main effort. Worth Ahmed is taking the Fondouk axis. Your mission is now to fix enemy in position. Do not advance to objective. I say again, do not advance to objective. Hold current position and maintain contact. Acknowledge. Read those words again. Hold current position. Reed was in a kill zone. 3 tanks were burning. His radio operator, Corporal Tommy Wynn, 20 years old, of San Francisco, California, had a tourniquet on his right forearm from a fragment wound, was still working the handset with his left hand. The enemy was on 3 sides, and his orders had just changed from take the objective to stay exactly where you are and keep dying. Reed keyed his mic. Titan 6, Bravo 6. Understood. Request clarification on support available. A pause. Then, negative on fire support. Air is diverted to northern sector. No artillery cleared in this grid. You are on your own. Titan 6 out. On your own. Titan 6 out. On your own. The silence that followed that transmission. The specific silence between a last radio call and the awareness that the silence is now complete is the silence that Reed would describe in his after-action report as the moment where the army stops and the man starts. His company was now down to 6 functional tanks, 11 infantry able to fight, 2 wounded who could not, and a radio with a damaged antenna that would receive but transmit only intermittently. The enemy had established fire superiority on the approach road. Any attempt to push forward on the axis of advance would result in the destruction of the remaining vehicles. Any attempt to withdraw would require moving back through the same kill zone that had already cost them 3 tanks. Hauptmann Albrecht's operations log, written at 7:07 as his forward observers reported the American unit going static, noted, "Enemy has lost momentum. They appear to be regrouping for withdrawal. Recommend we allow them to break contact. Pursuit is unnecessary. The lesson has been administered." He was already writing the after-action report in his head. He was writing about the wrong Americans. A like on this video takes 2 seconds. For Marcus Webb and the men who burned in those tanks at Jebel Naimia, it is the least we can do. Here is the thing about Patton that most people understand backwards. They think he was about aggression, about forward movement, about the romance of the offensive. The ivory-handled pistols, the speech about Americans loving to fight, the theatrical fury that made him the most photographed general in the European theater. What they miss, what his enemies consistently missed, is that Patton's doctrine of aggression was actually a doctrine of information. He had articulated it clearly in a training memorandum issued to 2 corps officers on March 9, 1943, 3 days after taking command, 8 days before Reed found himself pinned in a draw below a Tunisian ridge. An enemy who fires reveals his position. An enemy who maneuvers reveals his plan. An enemy who does not move because he believes you are contained has revealed his assumption. And his assumption is his weakness. The principle had a corollary that Patton stated even more bluntly in officer briefings. The enemy is always willing to tell you where he isn't. You just have to be willing to stop going where he is. Reed knew this. He had sat in the briefing on March 9. He had written the quote, not the sanitized version from the memo, but the version Patton had spoken aloud, in the small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. Now, in the draw below Jebel Naimia, with mortar rounds walking toward his position in 60-meter increments and 6 tanks angled behind whatever rock they could find, he opened that notebook. The ridge above them was screaming with fire. The road behind them was screaming with fire. The axis of advance was blocked by 2 anti-tank guns that had already proved their accuracy. These were the 3 things the enemy controlled. What did the enemy not control? Reed looked at the terrain. Not the map. The terrain. There is a critical distinction that Patton made constantly in training. The map is a representation of what someone else saw at some other time. The terrain is what is true right now. In the rocky ground to the north of the draw, approximately 400 meters from his position, a dry watercourse cut through the base of the ridge at an angle that didn't appear on the operations map because it wasn't a road and it wasn't a named feature. It was just geology. It curved behind the eastern ridge, shoulder, behind the anti-tank gun positions, in a way that the German defensive plan had not accounted for, because the German defensive plan had been built around the road and the approaches to the road. The enemy had dug their positions to dominate the road. This meant every gun was oriented toward the road, which meant that the 400 meters of broken ground between Reed's draw and the base of the dry watercourse was, at this precise moment, covered only by the mortar position to the east. 1 mortar. Not 2 anti-tank guns, not 6 machine guns, 1 mortar, working intermittently, whose crew did not know exactly where the Americans were. The plan that assembled itself in Reed's mind over the next 9 minutes was not brilliant in the way that Hollywood means brilliant, not a flash of inspiration accompanied by swelling strings. It was a logical structure built from available information, shaped by a doctrine he had been force-fed for 10 days. It was the product of training so specific that it had survived the dissolution of everything else. The civilian element made it harder. At 06:34, Reed's infantry sergeant, Staff Sergeant Antoine Beaumont, 34 of New Orleans, Louisiana, reported that there were 3 Tunisian civilians, a man, a woman, and a child, sheltering in a stone outbuilding 60 meters north of the draw. They had been there when the ambush started. They were still there. The path to the dry watercourse ran directly past the outbuilding. The mortar crew to the east was ranging toward Reed's position using the sound of tank engines as reference. If Reed moved his tanks, the crew would adjust. If Reed moved his infantry first, quietly, on foot, he could send them around the ridge flank before the mortar crew understood what was happening. But moving infantry meant moving past that outbuilding, which meant either stopping to extract the civilians, time, noise, exposure, or moving past them without warning, leaving them in a position that was about to become significantly more dangerous when the Germans realized their defensive flank was compromised. There was no clean answer. Reed knew this. He chose the answer that preserved more lives with certainty over fewer lives with probability. Beaumont would take 6 men, move to the outbuilding, move the civilians 200 meters south into a rocky depression that offered cover from both the mortar and the small arms, and then continue north to the watercourse. It would add 12 minutes to the timeline. It was the right 12 minutes to the timeline. It was the right 12 minutes to spend. If we go around and those guns are still looking at the road when we come up behind them, Beaumont said, not asking a question so much as confirming a logic chain. Then they're not looking at us, Reed said. Beaumont went. Beaumont's 6 men were moving. Reed gave them a 2-minute lead, then started his remaining 6 tanks in sequence, not all at once, which would produce the engine noise spike the mortar crew was listening for, but one at a time with 30-second intervals, moving in a staggered line toward the north wall of the draw. The tactic was simple. Spread the acoustic signature across a 2-minute window, make it sound like vehicles repositioning rather than maneuvering, and give the mortar crew no clean reference point. It half worked. At 0658, a mortar round landed 12 meters from the lead tank, close enough that the crew felt it as a percussion shock through the hull, far enough that no damage resulted. Then nothing. The mortar crew had lost them in the terrain noise. Beaumont reached the outbuilding at 0701. The man inside, Reed would learn his name later, Malik Ferhat, a farmer from Fondouk who had hidden his family in the outbuilding when the German column passed 3 days before, did not speak English. Beaumont did not speak Arabic. What passed between them in the next 90 seconds was conducted in the universal language of a soldier, pointing at a child and pointing at safer ground with an expression that required no translation. Ferhat understood. He moved. Beaumont's 6 men were at the base of the watercourse by 0799. What they found there was not what the map showed, which was nothing, and not what the aerial photograph had suggested, which was a dry, rocky channel, perhaps 3 meters wide. The watercourse was 5 meters wide in places, cut into the base of the ridge by years of seasonal flooding, with vertical walls that provided cover from direct fire and a floor of compacted gravel that would support foot movement without the noise of loose rock. Beaumont keyed his radio, the short-range infantry frequency that Reed was monitoring on a secondary set, and transmitted one word, "Go." Reed moved his tanks, all 6, at once. Maximum engine output, no noise discipline, direct line north toward the mouth of the watercourse. The calculation was simple and brutal. The mortar crew would hear them immediately and begin adjusting fire. That adjustment would take 60 to 90 seconds. Reed needed 45 seconds to reach the watercourse entrance. The margin was 15 seconds. The first mortar round fell at the 30-second mark. Too far right. The crew had estimated the direction of movement correctly, but the range wrong, because the tanks were moving faster than an observer would assume for vehicles navigating broken ground. Reed's lead tank, his own, with him in the commander's hatch, face up into the cold Tunisian morning, reached the watercourse of the 43-second mark. The second round fell behind him. Inside the watercourse, the tanks were blind and the sound was enormous, the channel walls reflecting engine noise back in waves that made normal communication impossible. Reed used hand signals through the hatch. The column moved north and east, following the natural curve of the channel, climbing gradually toward the ridge shoulder where the German anti-tank guns were positioned. They didn't know exactly where. This is the part that gets left out of tactical analyses. At the moment of execution, the plan was not a certainty. It was a probability dressed up as a plan. Reed did not know the precise position of the anti-tank guns. He knew their general orientation, inferred from the angles of fire he had observed during the ambush. He knew they were positioned to cover the road. He knew that the watercourse curved behind the ridge shoulder in the direction that would put the guns on his right side, if the channel continued in the direction his compass and the rock formations suggested. If it didn't continue, he would emerge from the channel into open ground in front of the same guns that had already killed 3 of his tanks at a range where the Sherman's armor would not help him. At 0717, the channel narrowed. Reed's lead tank ground against the right wall to paint and a jolt kept moving. The channel was now barely wide enough. Another 20 meters, and it would be impassable for armor. At 0719, the channel ended. Not in a wall. In a slope of loose shale that opened upward onto a rocky bench, and on that bench, oriented southwest toward the road, were 2 German PAK-40 anti-tank guns and their crews, 12 men, working guns, pointed in exactly the wrong direction. No one on the bench heard the tanks until Reed's lead Sherman crested the shale slope and was physically among them. What followed lasted 4 minutes and was decisive. Reed did not give the order to fire on the gun crews immediately. This is a documented fact from his after-action report, and it is the detail that most purely illustrates what Patton's doctrine had built. A commander who, even in the moment of tactical advantage, was calculating forward. The gun crews on the bench were 12 men who had nowhere to run. Opening fire would kill them in place, but it would also announce the flanking movement to the MG-42 positions on the upper ridge before Reed's infantry could reach them. The machine gun crews would have 60 seconds to reorient their weapons toward the bench. The infantry, approaching through the watercourse on foot, would be exposed. Reed's Sherman rolled to within 10 meters of the nearest PA-40. The gun crew froze. "Beaumont," Reed said into the infantry radio. "Move, now." Beaumont's 6 men had been working north through the upper section of the watercourse on foot while the tanks occupied the bench. They emerged at the ridge crest at 0721, above and behind the MG-42 positions, which were still firing southwest toward the draw where the original ambush had occurred, because no one had told their crews that the tactical geometry of the last 20 minutes had fundamentally changed. Then Corporal Wallace Hendricks, 23 of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, the youngest rifleman in Beaumont's element, stepped on a loose shale plate and went down hard, his rifle clattering against rock. 3 MiG-42 crews heard it. 2 reoriented. Hendricks had a fractured wrist from the fall and was already up, which was either courage or adrenaline, and at that moment was indistinguishable from either. Beaumont had 5 men and a reorienting machine gun 20 meters uphill. He did what Patton's doctrine produced in trained officers. He chose the action that denied the enemy time to complete their adjustment. He charged uphill, not because it was safe, because it was the only action that collapsed the enemy's decision cycle faster than the enemy could complete it. The MG-42 crew that had oriented toward Hendricks' noise was in the process of swinging their gun to the correct bearing when Beaumont's men reached them. The second crew was still adjusting when the first fell silent. 4 minutes. At 0723, the upper ridge was quiet. At 0724, the mortar crew to the east, now exposed and isolated, aware that the sound picture around them had fundamentally changed, ceased fire and, as the captured logbook would later confirm, began withdrawing. At 07:26, Weed's remaining infantry element in the draw, 19 men who had been absorbing fire for 90 minutes, heard the machine guns go silent and understood. The way soldiers always understand things before they are told, that something had shifted. Private First Class Thomas Okafor, 20, of Detroit, Michigan, wrote in a letter home 3 days later, "I'm not sure when I knew we had won it, not when the guns stopped. Before that, there was a minute where it got very quiet, and the quiet was different from the quiet before. I don't know how to explain it, except that the first quiet was the quiet of something about to happen, and the second quiet was the quiet of something finished. The objective, not the ridge guns alone, but the road junction 1.4 kilometers east that the guns had protected, was in American hands by 10:50 on 1943. Reed's remaining tanks and infantry, reinforced by 2 companies from 1st Armored's main body that arrived at 09:30, held it against 2 counterattack attempts that afternoon before the German effort collapsed entirely. Beaumont's left arm had been grazed by a fragment during the charge of the ridge. He refused evacuation until the position was consolidated. Corporal Hendrick's wrist was splinted in the field. 3 other infantrymen had fragment wounds from the mortar phase. Corporal Tommy Wynne, who had wept that radio with one good arm for 2 hours, was evacuated to the field hospital at Tebessa. He would be back with B Company in 19 days. At Hauptmann Albrecht's command post, which his regiment had evacuated by 1100 as the American breakthrough threatened his entire defensive line, the operations log showed a final entry at 08:31, written as reports from the ridge positions came in. Enemy has executed a flanking action through terrain designated as impassable for armored vehicles. Source of maneuver not yet determined. Casualties and gun losses confirmed. The Americans do not appear to have followed the expected procedure. The expected procedure. The road junction at Fondouk El Awareb looked, in the afternoon of March 17, 1943, exactly like what it was, a piece of North African dirt at the intersection of 2 secondary roads, bracketed by low stone walls, with a destroyed German supply vehicle on its eastern shoulder and the smell of cordite settling into the dust. Reed stood next to his tank, which had taken a round through the rear deck during the final approach to the bench and was leaking transmission fluid in a dark stain on the ground, and did not feel what the newsreels later suggested victorious soldiers felt. He felt tired. He felt the specific exhaustion of a man who has been making decisions for 4 hours at a speed that human brains were not designed for. He felt the absence of Marcus Webb, whose tank was 3 kilometers behind him in the draw, and he felt the particular responsibility of a commander who knows that the men he lost were lost partly because the intelligence he was given was wrong, and partly because the orders he received in the middle of the battle were impossible, and neither of those facts reduces the weight of the names. He counted his vehicles. He wrote the names of the dead in his notebook. He drank half a canteen of water that tasted of the metal. Then he called battalion and reported the objective taken. The captured documents from Albrecht's command post arrived at 2nd Corps Intelligence by March 22nd. Among them was a tactical assessment written by Albrecht himself on March 18th, the day after the battle, as he rebuilt his defensive line 8 kilometers to the east. The document is preserved in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland in Record Group 47, entry 407-407, entry 47. It reads, in translation, "The American unit that conducted the flanking maneuver at Grid 441 demonstrated an adaptability that was not consistent with previous assessments of American tactical capacity. Their commander chose an axis of advance that our defensive plan had categorized as terrain denied. This was not improvisation in the casual sense. It was systematic exploitation of terrain. It reflects a philosophical approach rather than an individual act. I believe this approach is now standard in units under Patton's direct influence. We should revise our assumptions accordingly." Read that sentence one more time. We should revise our assumptions accordingly. Rommel himself, by this point departing Africa for the last time, sick and exhausted, his health broken by 2 years of desert warfare, would write in a letter to his wife Lucy on March 23, 1943, "The Americans were not what they were at Kasserine. Something has changed in how they think. It is not the equipment, which was already sufficient. It is something in the approach. They have learned to treat obstacles as directions rather than walls. I would have found this quality useful myself." The Desert Fox. Acknowledging that an American captain in a draw below an unmapped ridge in central Tunisia had done something he would have done. Patton received the after-action report on March 19th. His response, noted in his aide's diary and later quoted in Martin Blumenson's The Patton Papers, was characteristically brief. "Reed did what I told him. The difference between a general and a corporal is that the general can be everywhere through his doctrine. Reed proved it. The Fondouk El Awareb road junction was exploited by 1st Armoured's main force on March 18th and 19. The German defensive line in the central sector collapsed over the following 10 days, contributing directly to the Allied encirclement that would end the Tunisian campaign on May 13, 1943, with the surrender of 275,000 Axis troops, the largest Axis capitulation since Stalingrad. 41 men from B Company had entered the Jebel Naimia Pass on March 17. 17 had taken the junction. Marcus Webb and 2 other men had been killed. 11 had been wounded. 26 had walked out of the draw on their own legs and looked at what they had taken and thought about what it had cost. The lesson is not about courage exactly. Courage is abundant in war. Both sides have it, and it is not sufficient. What Reed had, what Patton manufactured in the 10 days between March 6th and March 16th, was something more precise. The trained habit of treating every obstacle as a message. The ambush told him where the enemy was oriented. The impassable terrain told him where the enemy was not looking. The wrong map told him that the actual ground was available for interpretation in ways the enemy had not planned for. Every wall is a door. If you are willing to ask what the wall is made of, and why it was built where it was, the road junction at Fondouk El Awareb still exists. It is paved now, a junction in the modern Tunisian road network south of Kairouan, unremarkable to anyone who doesn't know to slow down and look at the hills to the northwest, where the ridge shoulder curves above the dry watercourse. There is no marker. There is no plaque for Marcus Webb or the men of B Company, 2nd Battalion, 13th Armoured Regiment. There is just the hill and the road and the fact, which no landscape can erase, that the men who came through that pass decided that an obstacle was information, and acted on it. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather or great-grandfather served in North Africa, 2 Corps, 1 1st Armored, 3rd Infantry, any unit that crossed the Atlas Mountains between 1942 and 1943, I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit? What campaign? Where did they end up? What unit? What campaign? Those stories live in family memory and nowhere else. Write them down here. They deserve to be read.